Okay, our first topic today is the ABCs of pruning. And I think that there are a lot of people out there that are afraid of pruning. They think they're going to kill the plant or they're going to do something wrong. And so we're going to talk about the reasons why and how you should be pruning your ornamental plants. Okay, so the first thing I always want to say is know why you are pruning. So that is A. And then you need to know when you should be pruning. There are times, most of the time you're planting a flowering shrub, and the reason you're planting it is you hope to see flowers. So if you prune at the wrong time, you may actually be pruning off those flowers. And then the third question you need to be able to answer is how should each plant be pruned? Now, there are some folks out there that just get an electric hedge trimmer and make little meatballs all over the landscape, but that is actually not the best way to prune most plants. So we're going to answer these questions, and then once you can answer all questions, you can grab the pruning shears and begin to prune. So in the whys, do you have some dead or diseased wood? You know, when we have winter damage if we ever should have cold weather this winter, we tell you not to take out any damage when it first occurs unless it's broken branches. Because if we get burned foliage, that can actually serve as a buffer for the plant if we should have further cold weather. So wait until spring to do that. But if you have a storm damage where you have jagged wounds or hanging branches, you want to get that out as quickly as possible, because as it falls or it tears off, you could have further damage as well. We also need to eliminate structural problems. You know, if you have a plant that a branch is crossing back through the plant, or we have plant branches that are side by side that every time the wind blows, they're rubbing against each other, that can cause damage to both parts of the plants. And the third one, eliminate hazards. That is twofold. One, when you're backing your car out of your driveway or you're trying to pull out of a parking lot, if you can't see oncoming traffic or people walking or riding their bikes, you need to be able to limb those branches up, remove those hazards so you can see better. In a public place, sometimes we want to eliminate the potential for people to hide behind a plant. So those would be some of the hazards. Many plants, especially those that bloom in the spring, will benefit from proper pruning. If we don't prune, we end up getting a lot of older wood and they're not flowering as well. Fruit trees, we prune to get better fruit production. So those are some reasons to prune. If you've got a plant that doesn't flower as well because maybe it's not getting as much light, or you have a plant like a crepe myrtle that's getting powdery mildew because it's got so much dense foliage, we sometimes need to open it up a little bit. Roses, the same thing. We want to keep that plant more open to allow sunlight in and airflow, and that should actually increase the light levels on the interior of the plant and give us healthier growth. And then sometimes we plant the wrong plant in the wrong location and the plant gets too large. So we have to reduce the size. And that is something that if you just prune it back to the immediate size that you need, any new growth makes it too large again. So you need to prune it back enough to where it has a season worth of growth to go in. And then the last one is how you want your plants to look. You know, some people do like the meatball look or the spiral or the topiary. And if you like that, then that's another reason why that we can do some pruning. If you look at these two examples, what's the reason why? Well, the one on the right, somebody knocked on the door and told those homeowners that their trees were diseased. And they said they could save them. Well, what they did is they turned them into telephone poles. And then we got the phone call saying, how can we correct this? Well, you can't. Once you have topped a tree, removed the entire crown of the tree, it's going to have so much decay that that tree is no longer going to be a viable option. You know, eventually that tree will leaf back out, but what it's going to look like, see if you can see right here, all of that all the way down is going to be internal decay. And so when this leafs back out, you've got a hollow tree, any wind movement or storm damage, and it's going to fall on the house. So sometimes Mother Nature does this to our trees, and when that happens, your best recourse is to plant another tree and get some size on it before you finally take these out. These two were in my neighborhood, and this was a lovely old redbud. And why they did that to this tree, I have no idea. Not only is that unattractive, but it also eventually led to the death of those trees. When you're doing pruning, make sure that you fit the tool to the job. Now, we're all guilty of this. We're out pruning and we come across a branch that maybe is a little bit too large for our loppers to get through. And instead of taking the time to go find the pruning saw in the garage, we just keep pulling on that plant and twisting those loppers, trying to get that branch off. If we end up tearing that branch, which often happens, that leaves a much bigger wound on the plant, which is also going to lead to more problems for the healing. And when I say healing, it really doesn't heal. A plant doesn't heal like we do. I cut my finger yesterday, and next week you won't even know I had a cut there. But with a plant, once we've cut it, it always has that cut. We hope that the bark will callus or cover over the wound, but a nice clean cut is going to be the most important. And remember, with these pruning tools, if you're working with plants that are diseased, you can also transfer those diseases with the equipment. So you may need to sterilize the pruning shears in between cuts. You can use the dip and clip method. Just carry a bucket of Clorox water, dip your clippers, prune, dip your clippers, prune. Make sure that at the end of the dipping and clipping that you do clean those pruning shears, oil them down, and that will lead to a nice healthy pruning shear when you come back. Because if you store it with Clorox on it, you will come back to a corroded pruner the next time you go to use it. Okay, so let's talk about, we know why, now let's talk about when. Typically, plants that bloom in the spring, things like azaleas, camellias that you see here in the picture, forsythias, summer blooming or spring blooming spireas, those are plants that set their flower buds at the end of the growth season. So typically late summer into early fall. If you look at your camellia plants right now, some of them are beginning to bloom, but many just have the buds. Look at your azaleas. They'll have buds set for next year. So if you were to prune them now, you're taking off your floral display for next year. If you're growing summer blooming plants, things like this Althea or Rose of Sharon, crepe myrtles, our roses, they bloom on the new growth. So we prune those before growth begins, and that way we're not interfering with flowering on those as well. Now, if you prune at the wrong time, are you killing the plant? No, but you are taking off the potential for flowers. So all of the plants that you see in this picture, and this is just a sampling of them, are plants that do bloom on the old wood, which means they set their flower buds at the end of the growing season. So you see forsythia, you see that spring blooming white bridal wreath spirea, flowering quince, also the azaleas in the bottom corner. But look at the other two plants, big leaf hydrangea and oak leaf hydrangea. Add to this mix gardenias. These three plants bloom in the summer, but they set flower buds in the fall. So you've got a very short window of opportunity to prune these plants without interfering with flowering. You know, the big leaf hydrangea, when it goes dormant this fall, it will look like dead sticks, but those dead sticks contain the flower buds for next year. So if you prune in the winter, or if Mother Nature prunes them for us, we will lose those flowers. So here's another list of other plants that bloom on the old wood. So you see the azaleas and forsythias, but redbuds, dogwoods, those are all in there. Winter honeysuckle, magnolias, mock orange. And when we talk about magnolias, we're talking the tulip magnolias or Magnolia soulangeana. Lilacs, our fringe tree. Notice rhododendrons and viburnums were on there as well. So on these plants, we want to prune as soon after flowering as possible, no later than June the 15th. And, you know, if I say they don't set flower buds until August or September, why am I saying June the 15th? Well, the reason for that is that think about what the weather is like after June the 15th. It's typically getting hotter and drier, and we don't see as much recovery on our plants. We don't see as much new growth. And we want those plants to be able to bounce back and put on foliage and then set more flowers the next year. So try to get the pruning done as soon after flowering as possible, but no later than June the 15th. And that is true of spring bloomers. If you're doing the gardenias, the big leaf, and the oak leaf hydrangeas, usually those don't finish flowering until the end of June, 1st of July, sometimes middle of July. And so if they need to be pruned as soon after that as possible, but no later than I'd say about the 1st of September. Okay, plants that flower on the current season growth or the new wood include things like crepe myrtles, the summer blooming spireas, not the spring bloomers, and the buddleias, butterfly bush. Althea is included in this. So if these plants are growing and blooming all summer, then typically they're flowering on the new growth. Here are some other examples. Abelia, which blooms all summer long. The clethra, which blooms only in the summer. Vitex, and now look also, we have some hydrangeas. So if you're growing the smooth hydrangea, which is the Annabelle we talked about, or the panicle, the PG hydrangeas, those are plants that bloom on the current season growth. I'm recommending those to people who live in the northern tier because it doesn't matter what kind of winter we have, we can still expect to see flowers on these. Now, the other thing is just because you have these plants doesn't mean every one of them needs to be pruned every year. There are some exceptions. If I were growing butterfly bush or roses, I would prune those every year. Butterfly bush in particular gets pretty large and woody in one season, and it blooms on the new growth. So if we don't prune it, it tends to be a very large bush with very few flowers on it. So I prune my butterfly bush and my summer blooming spireas almost to the ground every year. And that encourages a lot of new growth, and I have a more compact plant with a lot more flowers. Now, if we're growing plants that we're primarily growing for foliage, I know hollies do have berries, so they do flower, but we're primarily growing those for green leaves. Our boxwood that you see here, clethra, those plants that are just evergreens, they can be pruned a little bit at any time of the year. If you just need to do a light shearing, you can do it 12 months out of the year. But if you're doing severe pruning, and by severe pruning, I'm talking more than 1/3, I try to get that done from about late February through, I would say, late May. And the reason for that, you want to catch that burst of new growth. If we wait until it gets hot and dry, again, recovery is very slow. If we wait too late in the fall and we get this cool weather in the fall with some rainfall, it may encourage those plants to put on a lot of new growth late, which won't have a chance to harden off. Or if we wait too late in the fall, we end up exposing that plant to potential winter damage. So I like to wait and try to get that done when that new growth comes on. And look at that boxwood there. Remember, boxwoods have most of their foliage on the outer edge of the plants. So if we do much pruning, the interior of a boxwood looks like dead sticks. If we cut them back really severely, it does look pretty ugly until that new growth bounces back and fills it back in. So be a little bit judicious on your timing with your evergreen plants. You also need to know the difference between a needle type plant like this Deodara cedar. We can also include into this needle type plant group junipers, leyland cypress, arborvitaes, pines. They only have growth buds where they have green needles. If you look over here, this is a broadleaf plant, and this is an Elaeagnus actually. And they have, wherever you see this stem attached to the main stalk, there is a replacement bud there. So if I were to prune this back and there's not even a leaf left on it, there are dormant buds on the old wood on a broadleaf plant that will sprout back out and start growing again. So you can prune a broadleaf plant much more severely than you can prune a needle type plant. So be aware of that. Needle type plants, you have to leave some green growth on the outer edges if you expect them to grow back. Now, if you take a look at this juniper here on the left, people will sometimes send us these photos and say, what happened? Well, we have to ask a lot of questions to find out what happened. But if I were to look at this picture, my guess is they either cleaned the house or they painted or they sprayed something. And the reason I'm saying that is if you look at this Nandina next to this juniper, both of them have damage. And we will typically not see damage on plant species that are not related at the same time. So we still have damage. Now this is a needle type evergreen. If we cut this off, it's not going to be matching the plant on the other side. So we have some options. One is to remove the plant something else there so that we don't have the exact same look. If we want it to look the same, we could prune both of the plants, prune this one and this one. But just chopping it off is not going to have that Christmas tree look again. we're going to have to find one of these branches here and actually bend it up. We can attach that with a clothespin or some kind of tie so that that becomes the new central leader and starts growing. On the new growth on a pine, it's called a candle, and we typically don't want to remove more than half of that candle at one time. So broadleaf plants, again, have the replacement buds. You can see here's a bud right here, but look at this burning bush euonymus. Every place that there is a leaf, you can see where that tiny bud is. So that is also called the node. And if we were to prune, we would prune right above that node, and those buds would then start growing, and that could become our branches from that point. Now, these are two examples from my yard. I had some very overgrown plants when I bought my house several years ago, and the one on the left is an azalea, and it was very large and woody, way too large for the location. The plant on the right was actually a clayera, and I did not prune or paint that cut edge. That's the natural look of clayera wood, that nice shiny thing. But you want a nice clean cut. And when I finished pruning, there was not a leaf left on either of these plants. And you can see how the growth has come out. And even back here, I'm still getting sprouts coming out along this. Eventually, this filled back in, and it's now a nice looking azalea. The same thing here. This clayera came back, and I now have a smaller plant. This is really severe pruning. So is every plant going to bounce back from this? Not necessarily. But if you've got a plant that is so overgrown, why not take a chance? If it doesn't make it, then take it out and start over with something else. But try again to get this done very early in the growing season to allow that plant a chance to come back. And don't expect instant results. It's not going to look beautiful within a matter of days. Okay, so we've talked about why. We've now talked about when. Now let's talk about how. Not every plant grows the same way. We have some shrubs that have a dominant trunk. Think about an azalea, a holly, a boxwood. They have one trunk coming out of the ground that all the branches come from. Then think about a multiple stemmed plant that has multiple branches or canes coming from the ground. And that is going to be something like a nandina or that buddleia, where we've got a lot of different branches. So they need to be pruned differently. If they have one trunk, we prune them differently than if they have multiple canes. We still need to consider when they flower. So just because we're pruning them in a different form, the timing of that pruning is still going to be based on when that plant flowers. So let's take a look at these two examples. Here on the left, we've got, this is Coralopsis or winter sweet, and you can see there's not just one trunk. There are a lot of different trunks or canes coming from the soil line. If we're going to prune this plant, we would actually thin out some of these lower canes to rejuvenate it. On this Foster holly, there is one trunk. You can't see it with all that foliage, but there is one trunk coming out of the soil, and all of the branches are generating from that. So we're going to do some selective thinning when we do the pruning here. We're going to do rejuvenation pruning when we do the pruning over here. So here's some other examples. The plant there on the left with all the green stems, that is actually Carya japonica, or the yellow rose of Texas. And that's what it looks like in the winter. And you can see it's got a lot of growth in there. So when would we prune this? Since this plant blooms in the spring, the time to do that is right after it flowers in the spring of the year. And one of the things I often hear is people say, but after it leaves out and it blooms, I can't see what to take out. It'd be easier for me to prune it at this point. Well, you can get in there in the winter if you want to and mark what you want to take out when it's growing. You know, put a little flag on it or paint some fingernail polish or something. And that way when it's time to prune, you can get in there. But I would hate to lose a season of flowers pruning it in the winter. So we can thin out a lot of this older growth. Now this plant on the right is actually a dwarf crepe myrtle. They never have beautiful bark in the winter like a standard crepe myrtle. So this is a plant that we're doing two types of pruning on. We actually, as this gets older and woodier and we want some new growth to come from the soil, we need to remove some of these older canes at the soil line. We also want to make it manageable on the top. So we're going to top prune it as well as do some thinning cuts at the base. And that is something we would do before growth begins because crepe myrtles bloom on the new growth. So these are cane producing plants. So we do rejuvenation pruning. We'd also, though, time it again, spring bloomers after bloom, summer bloomers before growth begins. Okay, some other cane producers. If you look at that picture in the bottom of the screen, that is the red twig dogwood. Now, red twig dogwoods and yellow twig dogwoods are grown because of their colorful bark in the winter. If we never prune a red twig dogwood, it's no longer red twigs. That older wood turns brown. So to keep it looking really pretty in the winter, every year after it leaves out, because when is its prettiest season? The winter. When it starts to grow in the spring of the year, get in there and take out up to 1/3 of the older canes at the soil line. As long as we take something out, a new branch or new cane can begin growing. If we never take something out at the base, it's just going to keep growing at the top, and we're not going to get that new lush growth at the bottom. So look at all these plants here. All of these do benefit from that thinning at the base or that rejuvenation cutting. Now, when you look at this is actually a blueberry bush, but it's a great example of multiple stems or canes. And people say, well, how many do I take out? Normally 1/3. We try not to do more than 1/3 when we're doing our pruning. And I say take out the older canes. And they'll say, how do I know they're older? Well, look at the size. So we can say this one for sure is older because it's got a much darker bark to it. The younger twigs often have a lighter color, but size and color is going to be a determination. So if this were our shrub, I would take out that cane. I would probably take out this cane, maybe this one and this one. And we're going to cut them right here at the soil line. As soon as we take that out, there's going to be a replacement bud down there, which is going to send up a new cane. And that's going to get us nice and rejuvenated. Now, when we're doing cane removal at the bottom, I personally don't like to use a pruning saw. And the reason for that is with a pruning saw, as you're going back and forth, chances are you're not just taking out one cane, you're damaging those around it as well. You know, if you can get in there and have enough space between those canes to use a pruning saw, by all means go with that. But I would prefer you use a lopper, and these are just some examples. Now, I know sometimes we get some bigger stems and we may not have the strength we used to. There are some now that have a ratcheting action that can help give you a little bit more strength when you're taking those out. But try to make that pruning cut as close to the base as possible. We don't want to leave these stalks or stubs. If we have this, we're not going to get new growth at the bottom. They're either going to decay if we don't have, we've left too much, or they're going to sprout out here and we're going to get branches, which we don't want. We want those canes to come directly from the ground. So if you do a good job of pruning, you don't even notice you've done it pretty much. If you look at this plant over here, that's how many canes it has before it was pruned. Here's how many it has after it's pruned. It still has a nice size and shape to it, and we're going to start getting newer sprouts then from the bottom, which will make a much healthier and happier plant. Here are some great examples of what not to do. This is a flowering quince and a forsythia that have just been sheared. This is again the electric hedge trimmer approach, where we just come in and make the meatball look there on the right, or just shear it on the left. And you can see that all of the new growth and all of the flowers are just at the edges of those plants. So if this forsythia were mine on the right, I would chainsaw it to the ground and start over, because you're getting a lot of old wood, and forsythia only blooms on the growth it puts on from the time it finishes flowering until it sets flower buds in the fall. So these plants are not properly pruned and they're in full sun. So think about how few flowers they have. These plants were properly pruned in full sun, and look at how many blooms they have. So if you're growing forsythia, I would suggest taking out 1/3 of the old canes every year at the base, and that will send up those new canes, and it's that living fountain full of yellow flowers, much more attractive and much showier than doing this. So learn, and that the only difference in these plants is how they were pruned. So pruning is a bit of an art, and you can really make some great differences in your landscapes. Okay, now some other plants. Now we're talking about a single trunked plant. This is where we do selective thinning. Now some people do the shearing again, but I think you get a better look on that plant if you've done some selective thinning. Japanese maples, you hear a lot of folks say, oh, never prune a Japanese maple. Look at the structure in this Japanese maple. That didn't just happen by itself. Somebody came in and thinned out some of the sprouts in here, did some selective thinning to get that form and shape. And once you've done it, doesn't mean you're done for life. You know, I have one at my house that I just pruned this past weekend that sent up a wild sprout that was growing 4 feet straight in the air. That took away from the overall form and function of that plant. If you look over here, this is a viburnum, summer snowflake. And you can, if you want that to grow a little bit wider or taller, it's your choice how you do the pruning. If you're doing Rose of Sharon or Althea, that's one that if you want it to be a tree, let it grow into a tree. If you want to keep it a bush, then prune it more severely. You get to decide what you want those plants to be when you do your pruning in the landscape. Now, the other nice thing is you direct where growth goes. We look at these stems here on the right, and you'll see that the top bud on each of these branches is larger than the buds further down on the stems. And that's a term called apical dominance. And what that means is that the top bud is the dominant bud. It's the strongest. So if you've ever grown an avocado from seed, it's like Jack and the Beanstalk. It grows straight and tall. And if you never tip or take out that top bud or pinch it back, it just keeps growing tall and straight like a telephone pole. It's not going to branch out. Once we pinch it, then it will start sending energy down to those lateral roots or buds, and they will start to branch out and we'll get a fuller plant. So we can determine how things grow. You know, I'm sure all of you have at one point had a branch that has fallen off of a tree or some kind of storm damage where a shrub was damaged and half of it was gone and half of it was going the other direction. By pruning to a bud that is growing in the direction you need those branches to go in, you can actually fill that back in just by selective thinning. When you're removing branches on trees or shrubs, you can see where the branch is attached to the trunk. There's like these little rings, and that is called the branch collar. So we want to prune to the branch collar. We don't want to leave a stub. We don't want to make a flush cut. If we cut too closely on that trunk, we end up having a larger surface area to callus over or cover up. If we cut to where that little concentric rings are, there are more hormones there, and that callusing or covering up of the wound is going to happen more quickly. Here's an example where they had a branch or a plant that was growing straight and tall, and we wanted it to branch out. So last year they came through and pruned it here, which caused those two lateral buds to grow out. Now, if you look at the tips of both of these, this has dominance. If we want those branches to grow a little longer, let it grow, leave it alone. If we want it to branch out even more, we can prune it back to another bud, and that branch will then start growing out in that direction. So again, it gives you a lot of control on how that plant is going to grow down the road. Now, shearing is a little bit different, and we often do this with hedges. Now, you can see the one on the right, that's a little topiary or poodle cut. I think a little bit of that goes a long way, but that's another way of just shearing, where we do use those electric hedge trimmers or shearing trimmers to do the pruning. When you got a hedge, the one thing I'd like you to think about is we want the top of that hedge or the top of the plant to be narrower than the bottom of the plant. We have the propensity to do the opposite. We want the top to be wider, or we want it straight up and down. If this happens, the top of the plant, if it's wider or like you see here, straight up and down, the top of that plant shades the bottom of the plant. And if we don't get sunlight down here, what happens? We don't have much foliage. And pretty soon we start seeing that woody trunk. So when you're doing the pruning, you don't need a real strong angle, but try to keep the top a little bit narrower than the bottom, and that should allow sunlight to get down to the entire profile of the plant. And once you've done these really formal shapes, it's something you kind of have to keep up with, because it's very difficult to reverse that trend and put it into a more natural looking plant. Now, typically when you're doing this kind of pruning, there's your electric trimmers there on the right and hedge trimmers on the left. Those are manual ones. Both of them work fine. Now, if you were working with plants that were diseased, of course, you cannot sterilize your electric hedge trimmer, so be careful of that. I had a gentleman once that had a hedge of red top photinias, and one bush on the one end had the Intimasporium leaf spot. That's where he started pruning with his little electric chainsaw. And he went from one end of the hedge to the other, and within a matter of weeks, every plant in that hedge had Intimasporium leaf spot because he transmitted it with that pruning material. Now, depending on what type of hedge you're growing is going to determine how often you have to prune. You know, think back, one of the banes of our world these days in our gardens is privet. Well, privet was the #1 hedge that was used in the 30s and 40s. And if it's kept pruned, it can look this nice. But the key is it has to be kept pruned, and you're going to have to do that probably once a month during the growing season to contain it. So if you choose a plant that is a little bit slower growing or will fit the size of your job at maturity, you don't have to prune quite so often. Now, this is a formal pruning, and this is actually a Master Gardener project here in Pulaski County. And those are small boxwoods. They're dwarf boxwoods. And what they're doing that I do like is they're not keeping each plant in its own little profile or meatball. They're letting those all grow together. So they're treating this as a very low hedge. And that gives this very formal design. They then put white begonias in the summer and white pansies in the winter, and it's a formal look. But again, Murphy's Law often states that if a plant's going to die, it's going to be right there in the middle. And in a formal landscape, you're going to see the problems occur much more quickly than if it's a more natural. Look, if something dies, you often can mask it or it kind of disappears. This is what I was talking about with the poodle cuts or the formal cuts. A lot of people do like this. And again, I think 1 or 2 maybe in the landscape would be sufficient, if any. But if you're going to do these poodle cuts, I would much prefer they be a holly or a boxwood versus a juniper. And you see in these 2 examples, the one on the left is a juniper and the one on the right is a pine. And what did I say about you must have growth points or green leaves after you've done the pruning? And what a lot of folks do is they don't prune every year. They let their plants grow for several years and want to prune them way back when they do prune. And if you prune them way back, you're going to have brown spots in your poodle cuts, which are not going to be that attractive. So if you are doing this with the spirals or the topiaries with junipers, do a light shearing, a light haircut every year to keep them manageable, to keep the green needles there on the outside. Okay, if you ever read my columns or know, I talk a lot about crepe myrtle. And this is not something done just in Arkansas, it's all over the South. You ask people why they're pruning like this, and they see professional landscapers doing it, or their mother did it, or their neighbor does it. But this is not the most attractive look. I think if we properly prune our crepe myrtles, they can be just as attractive in the winter without leaves as they are in the summer with flowers, and even in the fall with fall color. If you think about it, sometimes they'll say, well, it's too large, you know, it got too big. That was the wrong plant for the wrong location then. We now have dwarf crepe myrtles. This one here on the left is one called Rosio carpet. It doesn't get taller than 10 inches, and it spreads, and it blooms in the summer. This is a dwarf crepe myrtle here. It only gets to be about 4 feet tall. So we have crepe myrtles that can be no taller than a foot, and we have some that can be 35 feet tall. So choose the right plant for the right location, and you don't have to butcher or whack them back. When we're doing the pruning, you know, I like to see multiple stems on a crepe myrtle, but we want to do selective pruning, not cutting back to these ugly, knobbly, gnarly knees. We talk about these as stubs or, but that is not attractive. This is actually at a school here in Little Rock that I went to and my children went to. They've been doing that for over 30 years. And those plants are only 5 feet tall, and they are covered in these ugly knobs every winter. Where you see this, when you've done this severe pruning, what happens is it encourages rapid new growth in the spring. So we'll have, each of these will produce 25 to 30 new branches. So you've got rapid new growth. they often can produce large flowers. Well, those large flowers come on such weak wood that there's no support, and we have weeping crepe myrtles. If we have an older variety that gets powdery mildew, we have also totally cut down on the amount of sunlight penetration, and they're just going to have tons of disease. So this is not a good approach. Here are some other some good and bad examples. These were gorgeous trees. And I do a lot of what I call drive-by shootings with my camera. This was a neighborhood, in my neighborhood, where they took off that much growth and cut them back to this. Well, those are all going to really sprout back out and grow pretty rapidly. Look at these. These are beautiful trees in the dead of winter, and they have been pruned properly. Now, this plant here used to look like this, or the one I just previously showed you. They had those big gnarly knobs right here on each end. And so what we did is we went in there and selectively thinned out to 3 of the most dominant sprouts growing in different directions. We had to keep up with that throughout the growing season. And so then every year they come in and do some thinning. What you eventually want them to be looking like is what you see here. 3 to 5 main trunks. Branching begins about 6 feet off the ground. And then we take out anything thinner than a pencil in diameter. This is when they're young. We have 3 to 5 trunks, and you can do a single trunk as well. But the reason I typically go with an odd number versus an even number is that even numbers tend to line up like soldiers, 2, 4, 6, where an odd number tends to give you a prettier display. It looks more natural. So you see we have 5 trunks coming up. Our branching begins about 5 to 6 feet off the ground, and we're taking off all that little tiny twigs on the very top to get some more support. Once they get a good age, I had 2 in my old landscape that were probably 50 or 60 years old. I didn't do any pruning. I mean, every now and then I would take out a sprout that would start growing, remove some suckers at the base, but that was it. They pretty much took care of themselves. And speaking of suckers at the base, some varieties will do it the rest of their life. Those plants did, but once or twice a year, I just came in and cut them off. Other varieties, you never see a sucker. So if you've got one, though, that has suckers, you cannot use a herbicide. You know, I have folks say, can I spray them with Roundup? No, they are attached to the mother plant, and you will do some damage. Okay, as with anything, remember when you're in school, there's exceptions to the rules. I mentioned this before. The big leaf hydrangea, which this is a lace cap form instead of a mop head form, there's still a big leaf hydrangea, and the oak leaf hydrangeas and the gardenias. They bloom in the summer, but set flowers in the fall. So if you need to prune, you've got to do it as these begin to fade or after the first flush of flowers on your gardenia. But have a reason to prune. Don't just prune because it's too large. You know, I was at a house once where they had a 15-foot tall, 15-foot wide gardenia. It was on the edge of the house. No windows were being blocked, no pathways were being blocked, but they wanted to prune it because it was too big. When that thing was in bloom, it was stunning. So there's no need to prune there. Have a reason why before you start pruning. This is what that hydrangea looks like in the dead of winter. It looks like a bunch of dead stalks. Well, when we've got that, we don't want to do just cut it off. In fact, I've had a gentleman that one year he said, my wife's plants never flower. And I said, well, when do you prune them? He said, I cut those dead twigs to the ground every winter. Well, he was taking the flowers off. The top bud you're seeing on each of these branches contains the biggest flower. So if this gets damaged, right now you can see that one, just the top was damaged. So it's protected the flower bud in there. That branch can still bloom. But if in the spring of the year, all of your growth starts down here, not up here, you're not going to have any flowers that year with the big leaf hydrangea unless you're growing those reblooming types. But look at these stalks. This is what we want them to look like. We want them straight and tall. If you prune your hydrangeas here by not thinning, taking out older wood down here, if we top prune them, what's going to happen is it's going to branch out. So wherever we prune, we're going to end up with 2 sprouts. If we come back next year and prune a little higher, we're going to get 2 more sprouts on each of those branches. And pretty soon we're going to have what looks like a candelabra out there. Well, each of the tops of those stalks can form a large bloom, and that is a cane. It is not a trunk. So you're going to end up having those branches falling over under the weight of those. So we like to see these straight and tall branches. If the plant is too large, we're doing the pruning again in the summer as the flowers fade, taking out 1/3 of these canes down low at the ground. And when that happens, if you're not sure what to take out, again, you can mark them in the winter to know what you're removing, but do that pruning in the summer unless Mother Nature does it for you. Okay, some other special cases. Hybrid tea roses. If you're growing roses, all roses must be pruned every year. Now, hybrid teas, it's a little bit more of a science to it than just whacking them back like we would, say, a knockout rose. A shrub rose, we just want to prune. We want to get some size back on them. Otherwise, they get too large. And again, they're blooming on the new growth. You're not going to have as many blooms. But with the hybrid tea, they get the most disease problems of any rose we grow. So again, we need that air circulation. We need the sunlight penetration. So we want to prune to an open center. We want all of the branches to grow out like a V, leaving the center totally open. So we want to prune them back anywhere from 8 to 18 inches from the ground. But don't get a ruler and mark 8 inches and whack them back. Because if we do that, we're going to leave branches on the interior that are going to grow and fill in, which is going to cut down on that airflow and sunlight. This is what we call a node. And you know, they often say dormant season. Well, in Arkansas, we tend to have a lot of fluctuating temperatures in the winter. And a lot of times by late February, our roses are not dormant, they're growing. And so some people think they've waited too long if they're growing. You still want to wait till the end of February. And the reason why is because we do have fluctuating temperatures, and sometimes these plants start to grow and we get a late cold snap, and if you've already pruned, you've cut off your buffer zone. People want to prune their crepe myrtles in the fall of the year after they go dormant. First of all, you look at the cut plant then a longer period of time, but secondly, again, you're taking off a buffer zone in case we do have some damage or some problems. So wait until the end of February, some years even the 1st of March, before we take that off. We want to prune above that node. So find a node or a sprout that is facing outward and prune right above that. So we don't want the inward bud because this top sprout that we're leaving becomes our branch for that season. So if we prune here and we leave it like this, this branch is going to grow straight in the middle of the plant there, and this one's going to grow straight there, and it's going to be a mess. We want to prune here because even though these buds are growing, they're going to have a little bit of growth. This one at the top, it's the dominant one, and it's going to grow straight out, and that's going to be our cane. You know, here's a totally dormant situation, but rarely do we see that in late February in Arkansas. This is an example, same plant, one is pruned and one is not. Which one would you rather have in your landscape? You know, the one on the left eventually has flowers, but you can see the flowers are just on the outer edges, and you're supporting all this old woody growth that just doesn't look that attractive. If you're ever in Little Rock, go by the state capitol in late February, and you'll see all the rose display gardens over there, and they're kept very, very short. This gives you that nice, beautiful foliage, nice flowers, and that's a properly pruned plant. Now, I'm going to talk about climbing roses too, but let's go back and talk just about shrub roses. You know, a lot of folks are growing these earth kind roses, things like the knockouts or the drift roses. Even the miniatures need to be pruned every year. So if you're just growing them as shrubs, then treat them like you would an azalea. And, you know, I don't personally like to just shear them back into balls. I like to selectively thin to branches here and there so that I get a more full recovery and have a more attractive looking plant. But even your knockouts, you want to take them back 18 inches from the ground before growth begins. And when I say before growth begins, remember, they may be growing. In fact, we've had a few years where we had such a mild winter that they never officially went dormant. And we even had a few latent blooms. But if we don't prune, they're not going to flower as well. So even if they're growing, still prune them back hard in late February. Now with climbers, most climbers, we want to wait and do our pruning after the first flush of flowers. There are some, like this particular one here called Cecile Brunner, that only blooms once a year. And this was my rose. I actually had to take it out because it was too vigorous. But that plant grows just that much in one season. And I would whack it back and take it to this. And the next year it would be like this. I mean, it was just so vigorous. And it was planted in pitiful soil in my yard. But if I had pruned that in February before growth began, I would never have seen a bloom. So it only blooms once a year. Even those climbers that bloom all season long often set some flowers on the old wood. So let them flower first and then come in and do your pruning. So we're looking at a plant like this. Let's say this is our climber. When we're done pruning, we still have a nice structure to it. We're taking out some of this old stuff that's growing really far away. And by taking out up to 1/3 of the older canes, we're also going to start a new branch growing from here. You know, I've seen some people that had climbers that didn't know how to prune them, and they had a climbing rose bush that had a stalk this big around that would grow 15 feet out, but the flowers are on the outer edge. Look at how nice and contained this climber is, and a lot more flowers in that newer area, because again, those that are blooming in the summer are blooming on the new growth, and we want to contain that growth and have it where we want it. Now, when we talk about roses, there's going to be a lot of variability as far as disease susceptibility. If you've got a variety that gets black spot disease, know that on the front end. Do your proper pruning, get that airflow going, but then start a spray program as well. Okay, another special case that we need to talk about are grasses. All ornamental grasses need to be pruned to the ground before growth begins. Now I'm talking true grasses. You know, we grow monkey grass or liriope and mondo grass. Those are we call them grasses and we grow them like a grass, but they're actually in the lily family. So if they look good, they don't have to be pruned. They're evergreen plants. But true grasses, like you see here, pampas grass, giant reed grass, purple muhly grass, those are true grasses, and after a killing frost, all of the top growth, just like your zoysia and Bermuda grass lawns, are dead. The root system and the crowns are still living, but that top foliage is no longer living. Now, we don't want to cut it off as soon as we see it, even in the lawn, because that, again, is serving as a buffer or protection from that root system, or for the root system. But also with our ornamental grasses, we're growing them for the interest in the fall and winter. So even after a killing frost, that foliage and that plumage is giving us sound, texture, and color. So as close to the ground as you can get them. Something as large as pampas grass or maybe one of the giant reed grasses, we may not be able to get it to the ground, but try to get it as low as you can. And this should be done before new growth begins. So again, look at late February into early March to do that. And before you start pruning, pull back the old foliage and see how far that new growth has come. Because if you cut it way back and the growth had already started, you're going to have cut edges on that current season grass. So down there in the bottom, that's monkey grass or liriope. Not too attractive, is it? So if you have some liriope or evergreen ornamental grasses in your landscape and they don't look good, the time to do it is just when you're doing your regular grasses. And when you do that pruning, again, look at how far the new growth has come, cut that back, and that just freshens that plant up and makes it look good. You know, I do have some gardeners that say, well, I've had pampas grass in the yard and I've never cut it back. Well, what happens is all this dead foliage has to go somewhere. And if you're not cutting it off, it starts going back into the crown of that plant. And after years of that decaying grass going back into the crown, we end up dying or killing that center of the grass, and this dead center, we then have a dead brown spot in the center with this green donut growth around it, and it's not going to have the plumage and it's not going to be attractive. So your only recourse then is to dig that up, throw away the dead center, replant, and if you've ever tried to dig up pampas grass, you know it is a challenge. Most grasses have a very extensive root system, and that root system is tenacious, so it's going to be very difficult to get up. So a backhoe has to get in there to do that. So once a year, prune it. Now, I do have folks that ask me about burning. They say, can I burn the old foliage off? Well, if you live in the city, you can't burn, so that's not an option. But the other problem with that is you've got to be very careful. It's got to be a controlled burn. You know, somebody in a neighborhood sets their lawn on fire accidentally every year, and it grows back prettier and greener than everybody else. They all want to burn their grass. I've had folks burn or damage other plants that are adjacent to those grasses. I've had them melt their irrigation system. So my preference is use the pruning shears, cut them back once a year, and don't do the burning. Tree damage can occur. I don't think anybody needs to be trimming their own trees, but when you do have major damage like this, be aware that internal decay will set in, and those trees probably need to be removed and something else planted. But know the expectations for pruning. You know, I get my trees trimmed every few years. And when I have tree trimmers in the yard, I'm sure they're very thrilled that I'm there with them, but I'm there to say, I want that branch off, I want this branch off, and that will event that telephone pole look when they're finished. So know what's expected. Bradford pears are overplanted. They're one of my least favorite trees in the landscape. And I think because they're overplanted, they have become somewhat invasive for us as well across the state. But they're a beautiful tree and flower. And then in the fall of the year, they have outstanding fall color. But one of the other things that people like about them is that dense teardrop shape that they have. It's sort of like a lollipop on a stick. When the wind blows, a Bradford falls somewhere, and you see this damage that comes on. So when this happens again, I would take that tree out and start over. If you look at it, it's a pear tree, just like an edible pear tree. So they have a lot of branching. Don't top them, don't shear them back, but then also don't limb them up too much. The best way, if you have a Bradford pear that you want to keep in the landscape, do some thinning cuts, lighten this load, selectively thin some of those branches out. And if you do lose it to storm damage, don't replant another Bradford pear. These are some other beautiful examples. I said, I think only second to crepe murder is Bradford butchering. This is actually down the street from my house on Rodney Parham, and they take these Bradfords and they just top them. And what's really interesting is the time of year that they're doing it is in February before growth begins, and so there are no flowers. You're growing a Bradford pear because you want to see the blooms, and you're cutting them all off. So timing was wrong there to begin with, as well as the improper way. This is actually a church here in Little Rock, and their entire parking lot is ringed in what I call the bonsai Bradford look. They just keep these little bitty tiny balls on the top of those trunks, not attractive. And then this, I was dying to go knock on the door and ask why they left that stalk. So, you know, again, all of these examples are poor, and you should take those out and plant a nice shade tree, not a Bradford. When you are pruning, remember what I said about the branch collar on shrubs, same thing on trees. You can see where those concentric rings are. So here we are, year one, nice clean cut. Year two, we're starting to get that rolled callus edge where it's going to cover up, and we're almost completely covered up there. So this is what we want to see. Don't use those wound paintings or dressings. It doesn't help the plant in the slightest. It just makes you feel good. And here's some examples. These were pruned properly, but we're kind of drawing attention to it with that white paint. So just a nice clean cut is all that's needed. We do not need to use these wound dressings. If you're growing some really fast growing trees like a red maple or silver maple or something like that, and it's growing really fast, sometimes they do get these cracks in their trunks because they're kind of growing too fast. It's sort of like a split on a tomato. You cannot do anything about that, but keep it clean. And eventually, hopefully, that will callus over and you won't have any more damage. If decay sets in, it can lead to some internal decay on that trunk, and that can lead to a very weak branch. So you may need to prune that out. Some plants are going to have suckers. If you've got something on there, it may be a water sprout or a sucker could indicate that that plant is weak. If you have a plant that is grafted and it's producing suckers from beneath the graft union, eventually those will take over the whole plant. So remove those suckers, or otherwise you're going to end up with a bush at the bottom of your tree. And know what you want the plants to look like when you're doing the pruning. I think I timed this one pretty well. I think the crew that was doing the pruning took a break for lunch, but I think that looks like a chia pet. So they had to come back and finish it. When I'm pruning at home, I take out a few branches and then I stop and I go back and look at it. Because sometimes when you're in the midst of doing that pruning, you take off more than you expected to, and you can't glue those branches on. So doing some selective thinning, standing back, looking at it, saying, oh, I need to prune a little bit more over there or a little bit more over here, and then go back. You can always take off a few more. You just can't put them back on. So know what you want it to look like when you're done. Also, make sure that if you're buying new trees or shrubs, or somebody gives you one, if you see a problem, solve the problem the day you find it. This was a really expensive fringe tree, and it was at a library here in Little Rock, and they actually had to plant it to get the keys to the building. But they had two trunks. Here's one coming up here, and here's a second trunk that is actually wrapping around the trunk of that tree. And what I hear a lot of folks say is, I'm going to let it grow for a few years and then I'll fix it. The longer you leave that problem, the bigger that problem becomes. In the case of this tree, it girdled itself and it died. So if you end up getting something like this, take that one off, or better yet, don't buy it. If you see a problem in the nursery, don't buy it. If you're putting in a young tree and it's got what I call a tight V or tight crotch angle at the top, if you've got the branches that are too close together here and you leave it, as those two branches continue to grow, they get woodier and woodier, and eventually it's going to snap or crack in the center. So take one of those off. While you do it when it's young, it's not going to be much of a problem. So let's go over in summary what we talked about. You've got to be able to answer those three questions. Why are you pruning? When should you be pruning? And how should you be pruning? Know when that flowering plant blooms, so you know when it needs to be pruned. If it blooms in the spring, we prune right after flowering, but no later than mid-June. If it blooms in the summer, it blooms on the new growth. So we want to prune that before growth begins. And then know those special cases like gardenias, big leaf hydrangeas, and oak leaf hydrangeas. They bloom in the summer, but set flower buds in the fall. Then how does that plant grow? Does it have multiple stems coming from the ground or a single trunk? So do we do rejuvenation pruning or do we do selective thinning? Evergreen plants that were just growing for foliage can be pruned at any time of the year, but severe pruning where we're taking off more than 1/3, we want to try to get that done as early in the spring as possible so that the plants will recover. And also know if it's a needle type plant versus a broadleaf plant. And then know how to prune those grasses and roses. And if you have questions, you always know, call your local county extension office for more information. So pruning is not that difficult if you know what you're doing.